Hi, welcome to lesson 1.6, Economies and Resources. In today's lesson, we are going to learn how the First Nations relied on the natural environment for where they lived. So stick around and let's learn something. How did the economies of First Nations rely on the natural environment in which they lived? Welcome to lesson 1.6. Economy is how people meet their basic needs. And what are our basic needs? Food, clothing, and shelter. We use the economy so that we can meet these three things: food, clothing, and shelter. And economy is based on the resources that are available to a group of people or society. So from our First Nations point of view, those resources are going to be the land and the animals that are on that land. And that is what will make up the economy for those three nations that we've been talking about: the Mi'kmaq, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. When it comes to the hunter-gatherer economies, and we saw a few of our First Nations have this, the economy was based on food supply. If your resources are scarce, so if you don't have enough food, then you are spending your time gathering more food and making sure you have enough food so that you can survive the winter months. So if the resources are scarce, you're spending way too much time trying to get as much as possible, again, in order for your community to survive. On the other hand, if you have a great growing season, if you've got a great hunting season, a healthy hunting season, now you have plentiful resources. And if you've prepared for the winter months, prepared for your survival, and you still have now time, then you can use that additional time, that extracurricular time for art and recreation, which was very important to the First Nations. So they would gather plants, they hunted, they fished, and they did all of this according to the seasons. Now, think about it. They didn't have the modern technology that we have today. And there was no refrigerators, there were no freezers, no vacuum sealed products or anything like that. So the food that they caught had to be eaten fresh. However, they did develop methods so that they could preserve some of that food for the winter months when the climate and the weather were very unforgiving. And our First Nations comes as no surprise that they had excellent knowledge of the land and of the climate, so that they could survive these long periods of winter and they could come out into the spring as strong communities. And oftentimes, unless you were a farming community, which we will see in a little bit here, the hunter-gatherers, they moved their camps with the seasons and they followed their food supply. Now, because they were moving constantly throughout the seasons, they didn't have a permanent base, which means that the items that they had with them were limited in number because they had to move them around, and it made it difficult for them to trade. They did participate in trade with other First Nations, but they didn't have a place to store all of this abundance of resources. So when it came to trading, they were trading based out of necessity and what they could carry with them because they didn't have any permanent locations where they were living. Farming economies, on the other hand, did have those permanent communities. And these communities, they stayed in the same village year in and year out until the soil was depleted. Now, if the soil wasn't depleted, they could stay for many, many years. And these communities were growing where the soil and the climate were ideal for farming. And oftentimes, if you have your own garden, you might know this, or if you know anybody that happens to have a farm, oftentimes you are growing more than you need. And oftentimes you are having to give stuff away. Well, the First Nations did the same thing. Okay. If they grew more than what they needed for that particular season or that year, then they could trade those goods, that food, with non-farming First Nations. So they could then trade for other things that they couldn't get, maybe copper or birch for their canoes and things like that. And because they were farmers, and usually the crop was a healthy crop and a healthy harvest, this allowed them more time for art and recreation, which is, again, I mentioned this earlier, was central to our First Nations. And these farming communities, they had the ability to store all this extra food. So when it came to the winter months, they still had plenty of food available, and it was easy for them to be able to trade. And speaking of trade, a very extensive trading network did develop in North America long before the arrival of the Europeans. And these trade routes were extensive. And you can see here on the picture that I have here, these are the trade routes. There's obsidian being traded, shells are being traded, copper and silver are being traded. And the Haudenosaunee, they would trade with the Anishinaabe, which were in and around Lake Superior, so one of the Great Lakes there. And even the Haudenosaunee traded as far as the eastern coast for materials and for goods that they could only get on the east coast. And it is very common for something from the east coast, from the Mi'kmaq, let's say, for example, to make its way all the way out into the prairies, to make its way over the mountains and onto the Pacific coast, or even to the north where our Nunavut, or where our Inuit live up in Nunavut. And it's very common. Now, it's not going to be as quick as getting goods onto a truck or a plane or a ship, but these goods did make their way throughout North America using extensive trade routes. When the Europeans come, and we will talk about this when we get to the fur trade, they used many of these established trade routes to then go and trade for their goods and to trade for the resources that the Europeans needed. So these trade routes, and you can see here, this is from 9000 BCE up to European contact. All of these trade routes existed. Now, these are main trade routes that you see here, but there was also many smaller trade routes as well. All right, please head over to your notebook to complete the questions to check for your understanding on this section.